In this video, I'm going to talk about a sort of grief that isn't mentioned too much. It's called anticipatory grief, but simply what it means is the grief that people feel before someone dies. Because of course, if someone has an illness, there is a long journey towards death very often. So that might involve being ill for a while, you're not quite sure what it is, then you get a diagnosis, and that's incredibly shocking and scary. And then there is the trajectory of that illness, and sometimes that's short and sometimes it's longer. But at some point, it may become obvious, or you are told that it is a terminal illness. And within that space before the death, family members and the person who is ill as well can feel a lot of anticipatory grief. In some ways, it's not so different to grief after the death, but very often the feelings of grief before the death, in that anticipatory grief, are very acute. And it isn't just the loss of the person. It might be all sorts of things, like the loss of their life together, the loss of independence, the loss of a sexual life together, the loss of financial comfort, maybe the loss of the role that somebody had in that family that now has to be different because somebody else is poorly. So you can see that there are a lot of things that might be lost at this point. And the feelings in anticipatory grief can often be very acute. So they might be very, very angry at the unfairness of it all and scared about what's happening, scared about what they're going to lose, worrying about what's going to happen to perhaps their home, to the finances, to jobs, and how are the children going to be, and worrying perhaps about how they're going to manage all of that. All of these things are anticipatory grief. If someone feels no anticipatory grief, there's absolutely no shame in that. You know, sometimes we need just to really put on a front to get through what's happening to us. But it doesn't mean that underneath that front there aren't an awful lot of feelings of grief about what's happening and the loss of your life as you know it. I think it's useful for families to recognize this phenomena because we think of grief as something that happens after death, and we must remember that a lot of grieving happens before. In fact, in a study in Sweden of widows, 40% of the widows said they grieved more in the period before their husband died than after, which is a really big number. So it is a very real and present concern. One of the really difficult things about anticipatory grief is if we are the person caring for and standing alongside somebody who is ill and dying, we have to find a very fine balance between being hopeful, both for ourselves, maybe for our family, and for the person who's dying, but also knowing that they're going to die. And that's quite complicated because perhaps a couple don't talk about the fact that someone's dying within the family. And so that line between hope and knowing is kept quite internal, and that can make anticipatory grief really quite complicated. So I think what I just wanted to share with you is to acknowledge and recognize that there is an awful lot going on within people before somebody dies. Lots and lots of grief, lots and lots of loss. And again, as always, I would say that if you can communicate that to someone, anyone, even if it's not the person who's dying, if that feels you're burdening them too much, quite understandable. But try and talk about it to somebody, because hopefully that can be supportive to you.